I live to do this. And this is how I spend my life: is doing and preparing to teach when I have the opportunity. I have a group starting on Tuesday called they're Zoomers. The emphasis is on the Zoo, but it's a group that I do a Bible study every periodically with them, and we're doing a 5 week study on Ephesians beginning Tuesday. Uh, and these, I have a lot of what I call small accountability groups. Danny and I are in one of those small accountability groups on Wednesday mornings. And I consider what we're doing here today one of those accountability groups. We have to keep each other accountable. That's what our text is. Now, the text today sort of presents itself like a courtroom scene where there are three exhibits that are presented. Now, the first exhibit is a good one, and I'm going to spend more time on that good exhibit. It is the story in the last uh, section of the fourth chapter of Acts that talks about Barnabas. But I consider this, as I said to you, one of my accountability groups. That is my small group on Sunday morning. And we all need accountability groups. Perhaps you have an accountability partner. Walina and I have accountability friends, and we spend a lot of time. I meet with several groups on each week. One group actually prays for all of those who teach across our convention. The One of the laymen of the First Baptist Church of Houston, Texas, writes and provides information that many of you perhaps have used in your Sunday school class. But I meet with him and several others that we pray for what's happening across the convention each week on Sunday morning. So these are some of the things that happened prior to the fourth chapter and bring you up to date. You remember last week we talked about Peter and the council as he went before the Sanhedrin, those 71 men that were a bunch of pious preachers like Denny and I. They were the religious leaders, the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees that sort of were counted on to rule things. And Peter and John began to teach things that was contrary. All of us have heard the story. It's the Sadducees do not believe in the resurrections. That's why they are sad, you see, because they do not believe in the resurrection. Well, they were brought before the council, and Peter gave them a speech, and he really hit them in the gut when he began to talk about who it was that crucified our Lord. And of course, they continued in the response from the council, the Sanhedrin, and then, of course, the prayer of believers. But then this is the section that we come to today that we talk about how that community developed into the idea of being sharing all things in common. If you know any Amish groups of that nature, the Amish community does the best job of what I consider to be living like the early Christian movement did. Not communism, but communalism. That is, they built a community that shared all things in common. If you are familiar with Clarence Jordan and the Koinonia Farms in Americus, Georgia, it was an experiment began in the early, I think, probably 50s, 40s, and 50s, where he came back and attempted to live that out among in a practical way. These are the things that precede this. But now we enter into the case. I wonder how many of you remember this guy, Perry Mason, and how many of you remember this guy? Yeah, just the facts, ma'am. Just the facts. Now, can I say that to you as well, and then I just get the facts? Are you going to tell me all these other things to go along with? Well, that's sort of what this lesson is presented today. It's sort of presented as a lawyer, like a Perry Mason lawyer. We are, I guess, the generation of the first TVs, aren't we? I have a notion that if you were to think back, you could probably tell me when you got your first TV. I know exactly when we got ours. I remember how it was revealed to us when we got it, and I think because we had gone to my grandfather's every Friday night, he probably helped my daddy buy it so he wouldn't come over on Friday nights because my daddy had 6 children. Who would want 6 children to come be brought over and invade their privacy when he enjoyed being alone by himself? So he probably helped my daddy, but he never did tell me that. But nonetheless, we were standing on the back porch and we were standing around the well that we had on the back porch. And Mama said, we got a secret. And that the secret was we were going to get the television. And so that began that. But Barnabas is the character who is presented as the first exhibit. You remember Barnabas is the son of encouragement, but later in Acts, one of the things that I do, I prepare this kind of lesson every week, whether I do teach it to myself at home and I record it and put it on YouTube. So I present it so if anybody wants to see it before, they can go to that. I think there were 2 last year that looked at it. But I do it primarily for myself. But Barnabas was the son of encouragement. And Barnabas later in the 9th chapter of Acts will go with Paul. Paul was sent back to Jerusalem. And you may remember those people in Jerusalem, the church was afraid of him. And so Barnabas said, I want to be your stand-in. This man's okay. Now, Lee, do you have anybody that would stand up for you like that? Yeah, you do. You have a lot of friends. And I tell you, we need to have people that will stand up for us like that. And so that's how Barnabas enters later into the story. But this is the focus. And Barnabas is our first exhibit. His name was Joseph, but also he was a Levite. He was from the island of Cyprus, and we'll remember that when you look at the journeys of Paul. You know, remember where he was, and we'll look just a moment as to some of the responsibilities of a Levite. He was the son of encouragement. If you read the Jan Karen series, you will know that Father Tim named his dog uh, Barnabas, because any of you who are pet lovers know that if you leave home and the dog, you come home, who will greet you? The dog will greet you, and it won't just wag its tail, but it'll wag all over. And you feel like and as they say, those who go to Washington, if you want to have a friend, you better bring a dog if you come to Washington, D.C. He was a Levite with special responsibilities, and we'll look at those in a moment. Encouragement. Sold a field he owned, but we'll see that as a Levite, he wasn't supposed to own real property. However, the tribe of Levi never got any special property in the land grants that were given to the 12 tribes. But even as a Levite, he was not supposed to own it. We'll talk about how and why he owned that. But he sold that property, and it was his. He sold it. He brought the money and he laid it at the apostles' feet. That has the same kind of symbolism that washing feet does. That is the area of servanthood. And so he brought it and laid it at the apostles' feet. Now, the reason he owned land probably outside of the area where he served, likely it was an inheritance. There's no prohibition for owning land outside of the 12 tribes area. And likely this was an inheritance or whatever. But he sold it, he brought the money, he laid it at the apostles' feet. He gave everything. And so that's what he did. He came and gave everything, not just a portion. It was not that he came and pretended or kept some back, as we'll see later. Right. I want to talk about what it means to be a giver, what it means to be one who is accountable for the material things. Many of you perhaps have thought about how you approach stewardship and giving. Many people think about what, limiting amounts. We ought to look at how much can we give, not how little we can give. We need to look at areas where we can continue to broaden our stewardship. And so I think that Barnabas realized that this money could be utilized, and so he brought it and uh, uh, and gave it. But these are some of the roles as a Levite. He had priestly functions, he had temple duties. He was it sounds to me like, Denny, I'm describing a Baptist preacher when I look through this. Guarding the sanctuary, preparing the offerings, singing and playing instruments during the temple service. I know Denny and I didn't. We may have been expected to do that, but we didn't do that, did we? We lost our jobs if we'd done that. He was to assist the priest in their duties, and he was a teacher, and he was one engaged in judging. And I like this one. He was transportation and maintenance. And those of you who work around the church know that ministers do all of those things. The last church I worked in, I planted a church at a, in the how old when we started doing that? It was 70 something. We planted a church, and I cut the grass. And one Sunday I put out on the sign, our yard man will be preaching on Sunday. And there was one woman who came in, and she said, "Oh, he's not preaching the yard day. Yard man is." I said, "I am the yard man," and they were disappointed uh, because they expected somebody else was going to preach that day. But at one time, a couple broke down at the church, and I carried them somewhere, and I was driving a 1948 Ford truck at the time, and not because I wanted to, but it's all I had. And they thought I was the janitor. I didn't tell them anything. But these are the things. But the important thing is that as a Levite, he who was living in the parsonage or Levitical city, and that's how they sustained their life. Was sustained. It was sustained by the gifts of others. So even Barnabas, he was dependent on what other people gave. You look at the life of Barnabas; he was an example of giving. He understood the spirit of giving. And Dr. Carl Menninger observed that focusing on others can be the best remedy for one's own troubles. Generous giving has a way of routing out the tough old miser within us and the feeling of freeing of our spirits. I told this story a number of times about a woman who lost her husband, grieved greatly over the loss of her husband. And when she lost her husband, she began to have illnesses. And so it was a regular routine for her to go to their doctor. And finally, the doctor said, "Tell me, what do you do with your time?" He could find nothing wrong with her. She said, "Well, every week when I come to see you, I'll leave here and I carry flowers to my husband's grave, and I spend some time there at my husband's grave." He said, "Let me make a suggestion to you. Rather than taking those flowers to your husband, why don't you let me give you a list of people who are ill and need some assistance and a visit? Take these flowers to them." As a result, she increased her activity of carrying flowers and visiting others, and she lessened the activity of going to see her doctor. And that's what living and giving will do. And that's what the example of Barnabas is. He was sacrificial, he was a trusted leader, he was an encourager, he was a Levite. Now, I'm going to share with you some other biblical examples who were great contributors. You remember the widow who gave her mites. You remember how Abraham sacrificed his son. David would not accept a free offering. He paid for it. I have always been, it's always been important to me that I would be given the freedom to pay my way as a preacher. You know, they used to say you did not loan money to a preacher, a painter, or a plumber. And I determined that I was not going to have the reputation of being a freeloader, even as a pastor. And so that's what we determined, and we've been able to do that. And David is a great example of that. Macedonian church was a small church in its poverty. It gave out of its want rather than out of its wealth. Many people can give out of their wealth, but it's really a challenge to give out of your want or your need. Then there's Dorcas, who you will study in the ninth chapter of Acts, who was raised from the dead. She was a lady who was greatly missed because she was a contributor to the community, a great example of that. But then there are others that I want to talk about. This is one of my favorite books, Acres of Diamonds. Russell Conwell was a preacher in the Temple Church and Temple in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He was there in the late 1800s, and it was a small church, and there was a little girl that came to church and was turned away because she could not, they did not have room for her, like Buddy was talking about this morning. And he heard that she wanted to come to Sunday school, and he took her up and walked in front of the crowd of people and walked across and told them her story. Well, a short time after that, the little girl died, and she took serious what Conwell had told that congregation from that day until her death. She was saving her pennies. And when she saved her pennies, there was a collection of 57 pennies. And Conwell took that story of the 57 pennies, and he continued to raise enormous amount of wealth that served to build that church and many other things. And out of that came the stories that he wrote in Acres of Diamonds, one of which is about Allie Hofford. Allie Hofford was an Middle Easterner who had a farm that he labored over. He wanted more. He wanted to be wealthy. He sold his farm and went in search of wealth around the world, only to discover later, and it's a long story that I'm shortening, and it's hard for you to believe that a preacher would do that, but I'm shortening this story, and I encourage you to read it. But it is a story about how he searched and ultimately cast himself in the sea, committing suicide. And then the person who bought his farm began to search that farm and discovered the greatest diamonds in the world. The point is that we can look everywhere else in the world, but generally the most important thing that we're looking for is in our own background yard. We don't have to look any further. And so that's a wonderful story. But let me tell you about some others. This lady has been a favorite of mine. She was raised in Mississippi, washwoman, lived in what we would call a shack, a farmhouse, would patch her shoes. Her Bible was put together with duct tape, and she washed clothes and ironed clothes for people who were having weddings and graduations that she never got an invitation to. But she, over the years, at the suggestion of a banker, began to save her money. And in 1980s, Oleola McCartney took $150,000 out of her own saving account and established a fund for students at Southern Mississippi College. As a result of that, she was invited to the White House. She was given tours. It's just amazing what came to her that really, in all truth and honesty, amounted to a lot more than the $150,000 that she gave. And to hear her words, and she even wrote a book. And I've read the book, and you would be blessed by reading that book. But Ola McCartney is an example of what we are taught in this lesson about giving, being accountable for the material things of life. And you see there, like if you go on Sanford campus, you'll see a statue of Mr. Beeson, who gave 32 million, I believe it was, to Sanford, and 32 million to West another school. I can't call it right offhand. And you'll see his statue. But there is a man who gave out his as well. Here's a woman who gave out her want because she didn't want any more than to give other people the opportunity to live. You wouldn't have any reason to know this man's name, Jim Thomas. But I can say that at his funeral, Karen Peck, that will be singing here, is it this afternoon, sang at his funeral because when I met this man, Jim Thomas, he lived on Jones Circle, up in one of the worst areas of South Atlanta. He was in the basement of his mom and his mother and father's home, Floyd and Christine Thomas, who were wonderful people. He was a butcher. She was just a housewife. He told me the story at her death that when he was a young man working, he just got out of school, hadn't or was in high school, and began to work. When he began to work, his mother said, "Since you're working, I want you to make a contribution to the family. I want you to pay rent." He resented every dollar he paid her, and I'll make this short too. When he graduated from high school, she excused herself from the family gathered in talking and celebrating, and came back, and she had a little. You remember those little saving accounts books that we had? She came back with a little savings account book, and she showed him that every dollar he resented paying rent, she put in the bank for him, so that now he had the money to go to college. I tell you that story because the first time I met him, he was in the basement of his mom and dad's home, and was here back from Texas because he had bankrupted, had to give his house in deed of foreclosure, and was in living there. 10 years later, he after his mom and dad's death, and I'd done both their funerals, he came to a service, and we were building a new building at the time, and were raising money for the sanctuary, a new building, a new sanctuary. And he asked me, and I'd almost forgotten who he was. He asked me, he's coming out. He said, "How much more money do you need?" And I remembered 10 years ago him being bankrupt. And you've heard people, and we'll read about those people in just a moment, that is that, talk a big talk. I paid little attention to it. Time passed, and one day I was on listening, and a phone call came, and the secretary said, "Jim Thomas wants to talk to you." I thought it was a salesman. Whenever he came on the phone, he said, "The eagle has landed." We remember that in the space program, but in Texas, that meant the deal was done. And then he said, "How much money do you need?" Ultimately, he gave $750,000 to a project to build a church. Only a few weeks later, after making the final contribution to the church, he died because he was taking aggressively treating an illness that brought his death. I simply say that out of accountability, it's amazing what we can do. But then we move on to the rest of the story, and that is Exhibit 2. Ananias, a man that will live in infancy, whatever that word is, I can't get it out right now. But anyhow, he sold a piece of land, but it was his land. He owned it. He had the right to sell it. But that's not the problem. He kept back He wanted everybody to think he was like Barnabas, that is, a man of great reputation, of honesty, of truthfulness, accountability, etc. But he kept back part of the proceeds with his wife's knowledge and brought a portion of it and laid it at the apostles' feet. Verse 3, Ananias, Peter asked him, why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit and keep back part of the proceeds of the land? Wasn't it yours? While you possessed it, you owned it. And after it was so, wasn't it at your disposal? Why is it that you planned this thing in your heart? You have not lied to people, but to God. That's something we all need to keep in mind, that we often find ourselves. Are you walking your sleep, sweetheart? She told me that the last time she texted me about me teaching and somebody enjoying it, she said, "Well, they must have needed a good nap." So that's why that's good. Because my children, the church has always kept us poor, but my children have always kept me humble. At once, I got 5 files of sermons in my basement to which I cannot go. And I've always told them, I said, if we have a fire in our house, would you please be sure the files get taken out? And they would, and I said, and they would look at me when I would tell them that and say, why? 7 files of sermons. Why would you want us to save those? But let's get back to the text. Verse 4, excuse me, verse 4 or 5, one or the other. I don't know why I got two. Oh, I know why. But it's verse 4. When he heard these words, Ananias dropped dead, and a great fear came. Excuse me. Great fear came on all who heard. The young men got up, wrapped his body, carried it out, and buried him. So that it was ultimate and quick judgment on his behavior. I did something last night. I passed up this program many times on the TV called American Greed. Have any of you watched that? Man, was I ever surprised last night. It reminded me of today's lesson. In the jungle, if a hunter wants to catch a monkey, he'll put a basket out and put bananas in the basket. And the monkey will reach his hand in the basket and will not turn loose of it. So, because it holds on to the banana, it cannot take its hand out of the basket. And so they're trapped that way. Well, that's exactly what the money trap of greed can do to all of us. There's the bait that comes from, where, and it's in the form of the monkey, it's the food. His unwillingness to let it go. And there's a story out of the disaster that happened with the Titanic of people who wanted to hold on to their gold and it sank them to the bottom of the sea because of their greed. We have to be careful. And it ultimately can lead to capture, to complete submission to the world and materialism. And it can lead, of course, to our own spiritual fall. And then there was his wife. She should have known better. Most women would have told him to begin with not to do it. I don't know why she was different from most women. Are good consciences to us, aren't they, Lee? When we need some guidance, Yvette, I'm sure, is your conscience at time on shit. Don't do it, Lee. Don't do it. And after 3 hours later, his wife came in, not knowing what happened. Tell me, Peter asked her, did you sell this land for a certain price? And what did she say? Yes, we did. And for that price, are you sure? Oh, yeah, that's what we sold it for. And she agreed with him. And of course, that was the wrong thing to do. It's okay now and then to agree with us, but not sometimes. Then Peter said to her, "Why did you agree to test the Spirit of the Lord? Look, the feet of those who have buried your husband are at the door, and they will carry you out." Instantly, she dropped dead at his feet. When the young men came in, they found her, carried her out, and buried her beside her husband. Then great fear came on the whole church and all who heard these things. We need to be aware. Now, look at the first exhibit. That's who we ought to focus our attention on. That is Barnabas. But then there are these examples of what being or attempting to deceive others, not being accountable, will ultimately lead to us. Ananias and Sapphira wanted the prize without the price. The high cost of lying is obvious in this story, but every day on the TV, right now, unfolding before us, is an example of lying, 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 and the high cost that comes. We can be enslaved by desire, and the total of lies are enormous. We are to be accountable. As an employee, we are accountable. As a family, we are accountable. As a church, we are accountable. As personally, we are ultimately accountable to God for all the attitudes and actions that we have. We are to examine our motives, embrace discipline, extend grace to others. The conclusion to this is that believers, we must examine and know that motives matter. Believers must examine their hearts when giving, not seeking praise or personal gain. And that's exactly what Ananias and Sapphira wanted. They wanted the applause of men. And what does the scripture tell us? When you have the applause of men, you have your reward. As a church, we need to recognize that we are to reverence God and awe, and when we come before Him, to reverence Him. And then lastly, we are to discipline ourselves and find restoration as we are accountable to one another and accountable for the actions of our life. And for some reason, my wife always puts this picture in.